Most people don't struggle because they lack intelligence or effort. They struggle because no one ever explained the rules that quietly govern human behavior. If you've ever felt overlooked despite doing things right, misunderstood while trying to be reasonable, or drained from playing fair in situations that weren't designed to be fair, this channel is for you. Unspoken Laws doesn't teach manipulation. It reveals the dynamics already shaping outcomes, whether you see them or not. Here, we replace confusion with clarity, not to make you harder, but to help you move through the world without losing yourself. Let's begin. Most people who value fairness don't talk about the cost of it, not because the cost isn't real, but because it's subtle. It doesn't arrive as conflict or punishment. It arrives as a quiet imbalance that's hard to name. Being fair often means giving the benefit of the doubt. It means explaining yourself clearly. It means assuming others are operating with the same intentions you are. And for a long time, this seems like strength. It feels mature. It feels ethical. But there's a moment many people recognize only in hindsight. A moment when they realize that while they were being fair, someone else was simply being strategic, not malicious, just unrestrained by the same internal rules. What's rarely said is that fairness is not a neutral force in social systems. It has weight, it has direction, and in environments where incentives are uneven, fairness often travels only one way. You may have noticed this at work. You do more than is asked because it feels right. You speak carefully to avoid misunderstanding. You wait your turn. And somehow, without a clear incident to point to, you end up carrying more responsibility with less recognition. Or in relationships, you listen, you compromise, you try to be reasonable even when something feels off. And over time, your needs become quieter, while the other person's preferences become the default. This isn't because fairness is a flaw. It's because fairness, when uncontained, becomes a signal. Quietly, without announcement, it tells the system what you're willing to absorb. Most people don't realize this is happening while it's happening. They only feel the result. The fatigue, the sense of being slightly diminished, the confusion of wondering how doing the right thing led to feeling less respected. This isn't about becoming cynical, and it's not about withholding kindness. It's about noticing that social environments respond not just to intentions, but to patterns. And fairness, when offered without boundaries, often teaches others where the edge is missing. That tension between being fair and staying intact is where this conversation begins. There's a reason this dynamic is so hard to talk about. The moment you name it, it can sound like complaint, or bitterness, or a justification for becoming someone you don't want to be. So most people stay quiet. They tell themselves they're imagining it, that if they just stay consistent, things will balance out on their own. What's rarely acknowledged is that many social systems don't correct imbalance automatically. They stabilize around it. When you consistently choose fairness, you often do so internally. It's a private commitment. You don't announce it. You don't ask for credit. You assume it will be felt. But systems don't respond to what you feel. They respond to what you permit. This is where the invisible cost begins to form. Not as exploitation, not as betrayal, but as quiet redistribution. Your flexibility fills the gaps others leave. Your patience absorbs friction that would otherwise surface. Your willingness to understand becomes the buffer that keeps discomfort from reaching anyone else. Over time, this creates a strange reversal. The person most capable of holding things together becomes the one expected to do so, not because they were asked, but because they never resisted. And resistance doesn't have to mean conflict. Sometimes it's simply the absence of immediate accommodation. A pause, a non-response, a moment where the system has to feel its own weight. Many fair-minded people skip this moment entirely. They preempt it. They smooth it over before it's even registered. This isn't generosity, it's reflex, often learned early. In families where keeping peace mattered more than being seen. In environments where being easy was praised and having needs was inconvenient. Fairness became safety. Restraint became identity. So later in life, when fairness starts costing something, it feels personal, as if the world is punishing you for being decent. But what's happening is more structural than moral. You're encountering a rule that was never explained. That fairness without containment doesn't elevate status. It often lowers it, not because people dislike fairness, but because fairness, when consistently unguarded, removes friction from others' behavior, and friction is often the only feedback systems used to recalibrate. This is why the cost feels invisible. No one takes anything from you outright. They simply adjust around what you quietly provide. By the time you notice, the pattern is already established, and undoing it feels harder than maintaining it ever was. This isn't a call to stop being fair. It's an invitation to see fairness as something that requires structure. Without it, even the best intentions slowly turn inward and become weight you carry alone. One of the most confusing aspects of this pattern is that nothing overtly wrong appears to be happening. There's no clear moment of disrespect, no obvious line crossed, just a gradual shift in how you're positioned. You may notice people checking in with you less, decisions being made without your input, assumptions forming about what you'll tolerate, what you'll handle, what you'll adapt to. And because you're fair, you often adapt. This is where fairness quietly turns into predictability. And predictability, in social systems, often gets treated as capacity, not authority, not leadership. Capacity. You become the person who can handle it, who won't make things difficult, who understands. Understanding, in itself, is not the issue. The issue is when understanding replaces mutual consideration. Most people don't consciously decide to take more from someone who is fair. They simply respond to what creates the least resistance. This isn't cruelty, it's gravity. And gravity doesn't need intent. When you consistently choose to be reasonable, you remove the need for others to be careful with you. Your restraint becomes part of the environment, invisibly, reliable, taken for granted. What's rarely said is that respect is not built solely on goodness. It's built on clarity. Clarity about where you end. Clarity about what you hold. Clarity about what cannot be assumed. Fair people often assume their internal clarity is visible, that because they know what they value, others will sense it. But social systems don't read values. They read behavior, and behavior that always bends gets interpreted as behavior that can. This is why many thoughtful people experience a quiet erosion of self-respect over time. Not because they regret being kind, but because they feel themselves disappearing in small, rationalized ways. They say yes when they mean maybe. They stay silent when something feels off. They explain instead of stopping. Each individual moment seems harmless, even noble, but the accumulation tells a different story. You begin to feel slightly misaligned with yourself. Not dramatically, just enough to feel tired in a way rest doesn't fix. This isn't burnout. It's containment loss. You've been fair in environments that interpret fairness as availability, and availability without boundaries doesn't invite respect. It invites use. Again, not malicious use, but structural use. This is the unspoken tension many people live inside without language for it. They don't want to become guarded. They don't want to harden. They just want their fairness to stop costing them their place. Understanding this isn't about changing who you are. It's about recognizing that fairness needs edges, not to exclude others, but to keep yourself from being slowly, quietly erased. There's often a moment when fair-minded people start questioning themselves, not in a dramatic way, more like a low, persistent doubt. They wonder if they're being too sensitive, if they're reading into things, if expecting reciprocity is somehow unreasonable. This self-questioning becomes another invisible cost, because instead of noticing the system, attention turns inward, toward self-correction, self-adjustment. What's happening beneath the surface is a subtle inversion. You begin managing your response to imbalance rather than addressing the imbalance itself. Again, not consciously, almost automatically. Fairness, when it's deeply internalized, often comes with a belief that clarity will emerge on its own, that if you remain consistent, others will eventually notice. That integrity speaks for itself. Sometimes it does. In contained environments, with people who are similarly reflective, but many environments aren't structured that way. They reward what's asserted, not what's assumed. They respond to what's made visible, not what's quietly maintained. So fairness, when unspoken, often becomes background noise, present, useful, but not acknowledged. This is why being fair can start to feel lonely. You're carrying an internal standard that isn't mirrored, and because you don't want to impose it on others, you carry it alone. Over time, this creates a particular kind of exhaustion. Not the exhaustion of effort, but the exhaustion of restraint, of constantly monitoring yourself to remain reasonable while something in you tightens. That tightening is important. It's not anger. It's not resentment. It's awareness trying to surface. But many people suppress it. They tell themselves that noticing the cost means they're becoming cynical. That drawing a line would make them less generous, less decent. So they continue. They explain. They accommodate. They stay fair. And the system continues to adapt around them. What's rarely acknowledged is that fairness doesn't protect you from being mispositioned. Only clarity does. Clarity doesn't require confrontation. It doesn't require force. Sometimes it's simply the moment you stop over-explaining. The moment you don't rush to smooth the discomfort. The moment you allow a small pause to exist. But before any of that happens externally, it has to happen internally. A recognition that fairness is not self-sustaining, that without containment, it slowly leaks into obligation. This recognition doesn't change your values. It refines them. It separates kindness from self-erasure, reasonableness from self-neglect. And for many people, just having language for this shift is enough to feel less confused, less alone, less like they've been doing something wrong without knowing what it was. Because the truth is, you weren't wrong. You were just operating by rules no one ever said out loud. There's a subtle fear that often sits beneath this realization. A fear that if you stop being fair in the way you've been fair, something essential about you will be lost. That restraint is the only thing keeping you safe. That if you don't manage the balance, everything will tip. This fear doesn't come from nowhere. It comes from experience. Many fair-minded people learned early that harmony depended on them. That being reasonable kept situations from escalating. That staying calm, staying generous, staying flexible was how stability was maintained. So later, when fairness starts to feel heavy, the instinct isn't to adjust the system. It's to double down internally, to become even more measured, even more understanding. But there's an unspoken law here. Systems don't read intention. They read limits. And when limits are consistently absent, the system recalibrates around that absence, not out of disrespect, out of efficiency. This is why simply being yourself stops working after a certain point. Not because you've changed, but because the environment has learned what to expect. Expectation is powerful. Once it sets in, it doesn't require reinforcement. It becomes the baseline. So when you finally feel the urge to pull back, it feels disruptive. Not because you're doing something wrong, but because you're doing something different. This is often the moment where fair people hesitate the most. They sense that a small adjustment might be misread, that not accommodating might look like selfishness, that restraint might be mistaken for withdrawal. What's rarely said is that clarity often feels uncomfortable at first, not because it's wrong, but because it interrupts a pattern others have grown used to. And discomfort isn't danger, it's feedback. Fairness taught you how to relate. Clarity teaches others how to relate to you. This doesn't mean becoming rigid, or cold, or transactional. It means allowing your presence to have shape, allowing your time, your attention, your energy to register as finite. When you stop preemptively smoothing every edge, something interesting happens. People become more precise, more intentional, not always kinder but clearer. And clarity is often the missing ingredient. Many people assume respect comes from how much you give, but respect often comes from what you don't automatically give away. This isn't about withholding as punishment. It's about containment as self-respect. Containment doesn't announce itself. It doesn't explain. It simply exists. And when it does, the invisible cost of fairness begins to shift. Not because you're doing less good, but because you're no longer absorbing what was never yours to carry. For many, this is the first time fairness starts to feel light again, not as obligation, but as choice. And choice, quietly, restores balance, without force, without drama, without losing who you are. What often surprises people at this stage is how little actually needs to change. There's an expectation that reclaiming balance will require confrontation, explanations, or a complete shift in personality. But most of the time, it doesn't. The shift is internal first. It's the moment you stop interpreting every imbalance as something you need to correct. The moment you allow others to experience the consequences of their own pace, their own priorities, their own assumptions. For someone who has lived by fairness, This can feel unnatural at first, like neglect, like indifference. But it isn't. It's restraint finding its proper place. Restraint, when it's conscious, is very different from restraint when it's automatic. Automatic restraint erases you quietly. Conscious restraint protects your center. This distinction matters more than most people realize. When restraint is unconscious, it operates as self-suppression. You swallow reactions before they fully form. You adjust before anyone asks. You manage the emotional climate without realizing you're doing it. But when restraint becomes conscious, it gains weight. It's no longer about keeping things smooth. It's about staying aligned. You begin to notice moments where you would normally step in, and you don't. Not out of spite, not to make a point, but because stepping in would cost you something you're no longer willing to lose. And interestingly, the world doesn't collapse. There may be brief confusion, a slight recalibration, sometimes silence, but very often, others adjust. They slow down, they clarify, they take more responsibility for their side of the interaction. Not because you demanded it, but because the space you used to fill is no longer automatically available. This is how fairness regains its dignity. When it's offered, not assumed. Many people discover that once they stop over-functioning, they're seen more clearly. Their words carry more weight. Their presence feels more solid. This isn't authority in a loud sense. It's quiet authority, the kind that comes from being consistent with yourself. Consistency is different from accommodation. Accommodation shifts to preserve comfort. Consistency holds shape even when things feel slightly uneven. And shape matters. Without shape, even the most well-intentioned person becomes diffuse, spread thin, hard to locate. With shape, fairness becomes something others orient to rather than lean on. This is where many people feel a surprising sense of relief, not because they've won anything, but because they're no longer leaking energy in directions they never chose. They're still fair, still thoughtful, still considerate, but now, fairness moves alongside self-respect instead of replacing it. And that balance, subtle, steady, unannounced, begins to change how the system responds, not all at once, but enough to be felt. Enough to remind you that fairness was never meant to cost you your place. As this balance begins to settle, another quiet realization often follows. Not everything that feels uncomfortable is misalignment. Some discomfort is simply the system adjusting to your presence, having more definition. For people who have lived without clear edges, this adjustment can feel strange, almost like guilt, as if by taking up space more deliberately, you're somehow doing something wrong. But this feeling isn't a moral signal. It's a relational one. You're sensing the absence of an old role, the role of absorber, of buffer, of the one who makes things easier for everyone else. When that role loosens, even slightly, the system has to reorganize, and reorganization is rarely silent. There may be moments where others seem uncertain around you, where conversations slow down, where expectations aren't met as effortlessly as before. This can trigger the old reflex, the urge to step back in, to smooth the moment, to reassure everyone that you're still the same. What's rarely acknowledged is that this reassurance often comes at your expense. It restores comfort for others by removing clarity for yourself. Clarity doesn't require you to announce anything. It's not a declaration. It's an internal decision that subtly alters how you move. You begin to notice when something isn't yours to carry, when a pause is appropriate, when silence communicates more than explanation ever could. This isn't withdrawal, it's containment. Containment allows interactions to become more honest. When you don't immediately compensate for imbalance, it becomes visible, and visibility is what allows systems to adjust. Many fair-minded people have never experienced this phase because they intervene too early. They rescue the moment before it has a chance to teach anything. But when you allow a little space, something shifts. Responsibility redistributes, not perfectly, not magically, but measurably. You may find that some relationships deepen, others may change shape, a few may drift. This isn't loss, it's differentiation. Fairness doesn't disappear in this process. It matures. It stops being a reflex and becomes a choice made in alignment with self-respect. And self-respect, when it's quiet and consistent, doesn't need to be defended. It's felt. People respond differently to someone who knows where they end. Not because that person is harder, but because they're clearer. Clarity removes ambiguity about what's available and what isn't. It reduces guesswork. It creates a cleaner field for interaction. For many, this is the first time fairness feels mutual rather than sacrificial. The first time being reasonable doesn't require being invisible. And in that subtle shift, something stabilizes internally. A sense of standing on solid ground again. Not above anyone, not against anyone, just here. As this steadiness takes hold, many people notice something else that's unexpected. They feel calmer, but also more exposed. When you stop cushioning every interaction, you're no longer hidden behind effort. You're more visible, not louder, but clearer. For someone who has relied on fairness as a form of safety, this visibility can feel risky. There's no longer the same guarantee that things will remain smooth. And smoothness, for many, has been mistaken for security. But smoothness often comes from suppression, from absorbing tension before it ever has a chance to surface. When that suppression eases, reality feels sharper. Conversations have more edges. Pauses last longer. Responses aren't automatic. This can feel like vulnerability, but it's a different kind than most people are used to. It's the vulnerability of being accurately perceived. When you're no longer constantly adjusting, others get a clearer signal of who you are and where you stand. Some will respond with respect, some with uncertainty, a few with subtle resistance. This isn't because you've changed in a threatening way. It's because predictability has been interrupted. Predictability is comforting for systems, even when it's unfair. It allows roles to remain fixed. When your role shifts from absorber to participant, the system has to renegotiate. And renegotiation always reveals what was previously implicit. This is often where people feel tempted to retreat, to return to the familiar pattern of being easy, flexible, endlessly reasonable, not because it felt good, but because it felt known. What's rarely said is that fairness, when it's paired with self-respect, requires tolerance for ambiguity. You have to allow moments where you're not immediately understood, where others are recalibrating, where the outcome isn't instantly comfortable. This isn't punishment, it's transition. During this phase, it's common to notice how much emotional labor you used to perform, how often you managed tone, timing, and expectations, how rarely that labor was reciprocated. Seeing this clearly can bring a wave of grief, not dramatic, quiet, grief for the energy spent, for the versions of yourself that stayed small to keep things balanced. This grief doesn't mean you were wrong. It means you're now aware. Awareness doesn't harden you. It grounds you. You begin to relate from a place that's less reactive and more deliberate. You respond instead of anticipating. You choose instead of defaulting. And slowly, the cost of fairness changes shape. It no longer drains you invisibly. It becomes something you offer when it aligns, not something extracted by habit. This is a deeper fairness, one that includes you. And as it settles, the world around you becomes less confusing, not because everyone behaves better, but because you're no longer misreading what's happening. You're seeing the rules clearly now. With this clarity, another subtle shift often becomes visible. You start to see how much of what you once interpreted as personal failure was actually structural mismatch. Moments that used to feel confusing begin to make sense. Why certain environments felt draining no matter how reasonable you were. Why some dynamics never improved, despite your best intentions. Why being fair didn't lead to mutual care, but to quiet imbalance. This understanding can be disorienting at first, not because it's harsh, but because it removes a familiar story. The story that if you just tried harder, explained better, stayed calmer, things would eventually align. Letting go of that story isn't cynical, it's sobering. You begin to recognize that many systems are not designed to reward internal restraint. They respond to what's contained, not what's tolerated, to what's consistent, not what's endlessly flexible. This doesn't mean you were naive. It means you were operating from an assumption that wasn't shared. Once you see this, something important happens. You stop personalizing patterns that were never personal. The quiet disappointment you carried starts to loosen. You no longer ask, "What's wrong with me?" You ask, "What is this environment actually responding to?" That question alone restores a sense of dignity, because dignity doesn't come from winning or asserting dominance. It comes from accurately locating yourself within a system. You begin to choose your fairness more carefully, not rationing it, just placing it where it can land. You notice which contexts respect restraint and which exploit it, which relationships respond to clarity and which depend on your silence. This noticing isn't judgmental, it's observational, and observation creates choice. Choice is where fairness regains its power, not as moral currency, but as a conscious expression of who you are and where you belong. At this stage, many people report feeling quieter inside, less reactive, less compelled to prove anything. They don't need to explain their boundaries because their behavior already communicates them. They don't need to announce their limits because their consistency makes them legible. This is quiet authority, not imposed, not performed. It emerges when your actions align with your internal sense of self-respect. And something else becomes clear. Being fair was never the problem. Being fair without containment was. Once containment is present, fairness no longer costs you your footing. It becomes a stabilizing force rather than a draining one. You're still thoughtful, still humane, still oriented toward balance. But now, you're included in that balance. And that inclusion changes everything, not loudly, not immediately, but steadily. It brings you closer to a way of moving through the world that feels sustainable, honest, whole. This isn't an ending, it's a settling, a sense that you're no longer trying to earn your place through restraint. You're occupying it through clarity. And from there, fairness finally feels like what it was meant to be. As this understanding settles, there's often a quiet relief that follows. Not relief because everything has resolved, but relief because something fundamental has been named. You begin to see that the exhaustion you felt wasn't a personal flaw. It wasn't weakness. It wasn't a failure of character. It was the natural outcome of carrying fairness without containment for too long. This recognition softens something inside you, the part that kept trying to correct itself, the part that wondered why doing the right thing felt so costly. You realize now that you were never broken. You were overextended by an unspoken expectation that your fairness would always be available, always flexible, always absorbing. Clarity changes that expectation without confrontation, without speeches, without force. It simply realigns you with yourself. You don't stop being fair. You stop disappearing inside it. Fairness becomes quieter, more deliberate. It's no longer used to manage situations that were never yours to manage. It's offered where there is mutual awareness, mutual presence, mutual care. This shift doesn't make you colder. It makes you steadier. Steadiness is often mistaken for distance, but it's the opposite. It allows connection without depletion, engagement without erosion. When you move from this place, your actions feel cleaner. Your yes means yes. Your silence means something. Your presence has weight because it isn't constantly dispersed. Others may respond differently. Some will adjust. Some won't. That no longer feels like a verdict on your worth, because your worth isn't negotiated through accommodation anymore. It's grounded in self-respect. This is the quiet authority many people sense, but rarely name. Not authority over others, authority within yourself. It shows up as consistency, as restraint that's chosen, not automatic, as boundaries that don't need defending because they're lived. And perhaps most importantly, it brings you back into the equation. Fairness was never meant to be self-sacrifice disguised as virtue. It was meant to be an expression of balance. Balance includes you. So, if you've felt the invisible cost of being fair, let this be the reframe. Nothing went wrong. You were simply playing by rules that were never explained. Now you see them. And with that seeing comes a quieter way forward. One that doesn't require you to harden, withdraw, or change who you are, just to remain present, contained, clear. From here, fairness no longer takes something from you. It becomes something you stand on, and that, quietly, makes all the difference. As we come to the end of this reflection, it's worth returning to something simple and grounding. If this resonated, it's not because you're fragile, and it's not because you've been doing life incorrectly. It's because you've been perceptive enough to notice a quiet discrepancy between how you move through the world and how the world often responds. Many people never notice this. They stay busy. They stay reactive. They stay convinced that exhaustion is just the price of being decent. You notice something didn't add up. That noticing doesn't mean you need to become sharper, tougher, or more guarded. It means your awareness matured. You can remain fair without remaining porous. You can remain kind without remaining indefinitely available. You can remain thoughtful without continually translating yourself for environments that aren't listening. This isn't about correcting others. It's about no longer correcting yourself for dynamics that were never yours to solve. The unspoken rule has always been this. Systems respond to clarity more than intention, to consistency more than sacrifice, to presence more than effort. Once you see that, you stop trying to earn balance through restraint. You allow balance to form around you through containment. And containment isn't rigid, it's calm. It's the quiet confidence of knowing where you stand and allowing that to be felt. Nothing needs to be announced. Nothing needs to be proven. You don't owe the world constant explanation for your boundaries. You don't owe fairness to spaces that convert it into obligation. And you don't owe yourself another round of self-doubt for noticing what's been quietly happening all along. The clarity you've gained doesn't change who you are. It simply brings you back into alignment with yourself. From here, your fairness can move freely again. Not as reflex, not as armor, but as a choice grounded in self-respect. That choice will feel lighter, cleaner, more sustainable. And perhaps the most important thing to hold on to is this. You were never late to this realization. You weren't behind. You weren't slow. You arrived the moment it became possible to see clearly. So take a breath. Let your shoulders drop. Notice the difference between effort and presence. You don't need to do more. You don't need to be less. You only need to remain clear. And from that clarity, quietly, your place in the world begins to feel solid again.